The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week, we'll be looking at the victories and challenges of women working in science, technology, engineering, and math. Hello, and welcome to Science for the People. I'm Raychelle, and today we'll be talking about the state of women in STEM. Let me introduce my panel. First up, we have Shohini Ghose, Associate Professor of Physics and Computer Science and Director of the Center for Women in Science at Wilfrid Laurier University. Welcome, Shohini.
Thanks.
There is Catherine Hill, Vice President of Research at the American Association of University Women. Hello, Catherine.
Hello.
We're also joined by Ray Burks, postdoctoral research associate and analytical chemist in the Midwest, and an active science communicator online and in various social channels. Welcome back, Ray.
Hello.
And finally, Jessica Cundiff, visiting assistant professor of psychology at Colgate University, specializing in social psychology. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks to all of you for being here. So, I regularly read articles commenting on the disappointing numbers of women working in STEM fields, but I don't often read about what those numbers are, so let's get specific. When we're talking about women currently working in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math, what are the stats? And I'm going to direct that to you, Catherine.
Well, great. I think I'm going to answer that in two ways. I think we have the stats around things like biology and chemistry, and then we see the stats around engineering and computing. So in the field of biology and chemistry, since the 1960s, over the last 50 years, we've seen really steady growth. Today, women make up 53% of biologists, and in chemistry, they're at 39%. So there we've seen really a lot of great gains for women over this time period. At the same time, there's the other half of the STEM equation, and that's in chemistry and engineering. And here, for example, in engineering, we're only at 12% of the workforce, and women are at about a quarter, or 26%, of the workforce in computing. What's interesting about computing is that this is actually a decline from about 20 years ago when women made up about a third of the workforce. So in computing, we're headed in the wrong direction.
So how quickly are the rates changing?
Back in the 1960s, women made up about, a little over a quarter of the workforce in biology and chemistry. And then when we go into computing, we're at 8%, and in engineering, it's 1%. So when fast forward 50 years, and we see women doing very well in biology and chemistry, they've made gains, but they're not as impressive gains in engineering and computing. Actually, that's one reason we're going to be issuing a report in the next month where we're going to be looking at those two fields in particular because of the fields where we see really less progress than we see elsewhere.
So now, except for Shohini, you are all American. So are those numbers similar to what we'd see in other countries?
Well, I can say a little bit about Canada, which is actually quite similar to the U.S., and I'll add that in biology and the life sciences, we've seen growth in Canada as well. However, we haven't actually seen that translate as yet to growth in the percentages of women at the highest ranks of academia or industry. So if you look at the percentage of women who are, let's say, full professors, across the board in Canada, if you include life sciences as well as physical sciences, it's around 10%. And if you look just at the life sciences, it's slightly higher, but it's a pretty low proportion.
Okay.
And I'll just add, in terms of the United States, we see a very similar pattern, which is when you look at the very tops of the professions, full professors, the heads of research departments, we see, again, many fewer women across all of the sciences.
Part of the thing, too, is how do you define science and engineering? It seems like every, year or twice a year we get big surveys that come out and say there is a problem, there isn't a problem, there's only a problem over here. Because I'm looking at some numbers from NSF on women and minorities in the S&E workforce, so science and engineering workforce. And even they spend the whole section of this big website report saying, how do you define that? And, if you're if you're just using numbers based on degrees conferred rather than who actually identifies themselves in the workforce, you can get a different picture, just like if you look at who is in positions of power versus who has a degree. If you went by straight degree number, I suspect, and I think that the data can show that you're going to get, this rosy picture that it's, 50-50, or in some disciplines, it would actually, be slightly higher than that. I think computing shows that that's not translating, but certainly in fields like biology, and some of the other life sciences. But if you look at the workforce numbers from NSF, and this is their, the numbers aren't always collected. It's often tied to census data. So 2010, they have women, total combined women in SME workforce at 28%. And then they actually broke it down. And I think this is another thing to talk about is we're talking about the status of women in science as if women are this monolithic group. But I think that if you are a woman of color, if you are in LGBTQ, if you have a different physical ability or you have physical challenges, then you are existing in an intersection that you are going to have unique challenges, and these numbers are not going to reflect you. So I think the interesting thing to me was, as a black chemist, was to look at the numbers and realize that in the SME workforce, 2% black female, but white female, 18%, and this is data. Basically, my main point would be, which data are we looking at? How are they defining, this workforce? Are we talking about degrees versus self-identifying workers, or are we looking at jobs, or, because we're going to get a very different picture based on just counting up degrees conferred and then translating that into actual workforce, and then not only workforce, but who's holding, quote, the big jobs: assistant professors, full professors, endowed chairs, deans, executives, mid-level management, CEOs. I mean, that whole thing came out, what was it, this week, that said that there are actually more CEOs named John than there are all female CEOs. Again, does degrees conferred really give us a picture of the totality of what women are achieving, and then saying the word women as if there is this grand sisterhood, that we're going to have a single unique experience? I think we need to be cautious there.
Hi, this is Catherine. I wanted to add to that. I think it's a good point, because we know that women's retention in engineering and computing, for example, is not as high as their male counterparts. So women are more likely to leave these fields. It's interesting, there's a big piece of work that's just been done by Fuad and her colleagues, and she did a survey of women in engineering who got a degree, and how many of them stayed in the field, and how many of them left. And then she also looked at why they left. So she compared people who had left in the first 5 years with people who were still in the field working. And the interesting thing was she found that they were similar in many respects, in terms of their demographics, in terms of marriage and having kids, and all of those factors seemed similar, but where they differed was in their perceptions of their workplaces. The people who stayed in engineering stayed because they felt, that their workplace was supportive. They felt that they were valued. They felt they had training opportunities. They had work-life balance accommodations if they needed them. And the women who left felt none of those things. They felt like they were belittled, or they just felt ignored, or they did not feel like it was a supportive work environment. So work environment does seem to be a major issue.
Oh gosh, we have so much to talk about. You're listening to Science for the People, and I'm here talking about women in science, tech, engineering, and math with Catherine Hill, Ray Burks, Jessica Cundiff, and Shohini Ghose. Okay, so we're already really digging into the why, so let's try and narrow it down. What is the research on why women aren't entering these fields in the first place?
to answer questions about why, you're bringing up kind of the recruitment stage. And so there's the recruitment stage and then also the retention stage. And so at the recruitment stage, there's been a lot of great work done in developmental psychology and social psychology, looking at how kids and adults are perceiving STEM fields. And what they're finding is that kids, especially kind of when they're trying to decide on different career paths, have an image of STEM, particularly engineering and computer science, as being fields in which you work alone by yourself and that you don't really produce work that helps others. So people are seeing these fields as incompatible with these sort of communal goals, these goals to work with and connect with other people, to have a positive impact by improving people's lives and helping others. So they're seeing these fields as incompatible with those goals. And what we also know from research is that girls and women tend to endorse communal goals more so than boys and men do. And so then when STEM fields aren't seen as being able to facilitate those goals, then you can kind of start to understand why girls and women aren't going into those sorts of fields if they value goals that aren't going to be able to be attained through those career options.
I think the one big thing that comes up over and over, both in the media and when you talk to students and parents even, is this idea that somehow girls perhaps don't want to go into fields that are math intensive.
Right.
And so that's sort of the big thing that's always mentioned. Well, and I've heard from a lot of girls that in classrooms they've been told that, maybe this is not for you. There's a lot of math here. Maybe it's more natural for the boys to be excelling. Don't worry about it. And that's sort of, something that's in fact a major misconception, because there's lots of studies done across different age groups across the world showing girls versus boys' performances in math. And the math ability does not in fact correlate with their choices of career. So high performance girls are not actually more likely to choose math intensive science careers. It's not really about whether they perform well. I mean, math ability has not shown really a big difference in, based on gender. But what does seem to have a huge impact is self-perception, as in how do girls versus boys perceive themselves in terms of math ability. So I think that's a major thing, and that's very hard to address, of course. That's about stereotype threat and imposter syndrome and all of those great things.
Well, actually, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development just put out a paper called the ABC of Gender Equality in Education. And they were actually saying the exact same thing, that it's girls lacking the same self-confidence as boys in science and math, but also that differences in parental encouragement exacerbate the problem.
I think another interesting thing to put in there would be the study that came out from the National Bureau of Economic Research just last month that shows teacher bias early in education processes, which again seem to be based on myths of performance.
This seems to be a myth that perpetuates itself.
And biases don't, they don't have to exist based on fact. They exist based on myth. And so if teachers are dissuading taking advanced courses or participating in camps or, subtle or not so subtle, then you combine that almost with parental whatever and self-perception. And, it's just a cocktail of dissuasion.
We know that stereotype threat can make a difference, even very small things. So, there's been research on when girls put their gender at the top of the page before they take their calculus test or at the bottom, and they actually see a difference. With that small reminder of their gender at the beginning actually has an effect on their performance. So I think a lot of people find these forms of bias, both internal and external, and we're surprised they're still there and that they're as powerful as they are. But I think what the research is showing us is that over and over again, we have a lot of these biases operating both in our own, back of our own minds and among those other people who are judging us.
Well, just one last thing on bias. You reminded me of another recent study. You said that the girl who puts her name on her calculus test. But there was a study that was done by Corinne Moss-Rakusen, a social psychologist, and they actually produced a fictitious resume for a lab manager position. 2 versions of the resume were produced, and they only varied in one very significant detail, that they had a male or a female name at the top. Mm-hmm. And guess what happened, guys?
I give you a wild guess. It seems to me that, you're going to see that difference with the female not being as valued as the male applicant.
That was over 100 biologists, chemists, and physicists that was sent to. It's painful that the results aren't surprising to us at this point. Decision makers do not seem to evaluate a resume purely on its merits.
And also, I wanted to add that, in fact, both men and women showed the same bias.
Exactly.
So that's actually even more discouraging.
This is Science for the People, and I'm here with a panel of women in science, tech, engineering, and math, talking about the research around women working in those fields. Okay, so let's assume that at least some women are going to make it through the gauntlet, and they're going to secure a position in the STEM field of her choice. What will she encounter when she's there, would you say? And I assume a veritable plethora of research exists on this, because I've read, I think, a countless number of blog posts at this point of what it's like to be a woman in a scientific field.
I think we're seeing more hard research. I think for, the numbers and actually getting past recruitment and then looking into actual nitty-gritty retention issues, which this would be a retention. I would judge this as being a retention issue. That data is really exciting, but I think you're really seeing people dig into it now. Kate Clancy and her team did something about field research and kind of, that whole thing, and that was a big splash this last summer. And so I think you're starting to see actually looking into retention issues or, quote, leaky pipeline issues that I think for so long we are so focused on recruiting data that looking at the actual environment is an emerging area. But there's been some interesting work done, but I think it's not quite where it needs to be.
So I wanted to mention this major study that was done in my field, which is physics. This was done by the American Institute of Physicists, and it's the largest study of this kind ever done in any science area. This was a survey that was sent out to over 15,000 physicists around the world, and they were sent to both men and women in the field. And the survey was about work environment. What are the challenges? What kind of access do scientists have to funding, to office space, equipment, students, resources? How do men versus women feel about the share of their of housework? How does that impact their careers? How does having children impact their careers? Did it slow it down in any way? And so on. And the results there were, I guess, in a sense, not surprising across the board. There was statistically significant evidence from the self-reporting that women feel that they have less access to resources, equipment, funding across the board. They self-reported, including the men reported that they do less housework and spend less time on that than women report. And women do report that they feel their careers have slowed down when they've had children, and that their career progress in general is slower. So I guess, we have that data, and the question is, how can we address these issues? I think it's not surprising that these are the issues. The question is, how do we address them?
But this is the problem, is that we're not surprised, but we still are having conversations throughout the world as to whether there is or is not a problem, which is one of the reasons why I'm just going to bombard everybody with numbers that's listening right now. These studies are taking place, and they are showing a significant difference in the ways that women in science move through the world as opposed to men.
I think that, it gets back when we keep having this conversation is that, there's lots of data that says that this is an issue. And that if you break it down further to intersectional groups, women of color, immigrants, people with different abilities, physical abilities, if you add in mental health, all kinds of areas, that the numbers are not rosy. But then you have studies that come out and say, hey, everything's great. And then you look at the data and you realize that they're not actually evaluating the same thing. You can have these arguments and conversations, but what is it that we're talking about? Are we talking at the recruitment angle? Are we talking about degrees conferred? Are we talking about positions of power or positions, period, in the workforce, the S&E workforce? So I think that all plays into it as well.
Well, actually, let's talk about one of those sort of rosy studies that you mentioned. It's somewhat contentious. It's a recent paper by Shumalit Khan, and it was titled Women in Academic Science, A Changing Landscape. So it basically states that although in the past gender discrimination was an important cause of women's underrepresentation in scientific academic careers, that's not the case anymore, specifically in math-intensive fields. Has anybody taken a look at that study?
I've taken a look, and there's been a lot of analysis of this particular study recently because they also wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, right, which was something like, sexism doesn't exist anymore in academia or something like this.
Right.
So I did go and take a look at the paper, and honestly, this is really, really a bizarre conclusion that they've come to, because if you actually look at the data they present, there's not really new data. What they've done is they've compiled data from established existing studies and looked at things like hiring rates and, rates of getting tenure, number of publications, salaries of men versus women in academia, and have essentially interpreted the data to conclude that there isn't a bias or there's no difference. But it's really bizarre because if you look at the data, it doesn't reflect their conclusions. If you look at for example, the number of publications that they show, it's very clear that in many areas, the women are publishing a lot less, and in some areas, the rates have actually gone the negative way in physical sciences, that the difference between the number of papers by men versus women is actually increased compared to in the 90s. And yet they look at all the data and say, oh, that's fine. And the language is very strange because they talk about, it's more or less the same and it's roughly equal. And this is really not a very scientific way to judge data. We have established statistical measures. We can talk about statistical significance, which they do not do. Okay, so I find it a very strange.
That's good, because I read the study and I thought I suddenly forgot how to read a study because I didn't feel like the conclusions necessarily followed.
Exactly. It's so strange.
Okay.
100% agree. I was reading this, and I've read some of the NSF data. In fact, I talked about that earlier. And I'm reading their paper, and I'm looking at the NSF data, and I'm reading their paper going, what am I reading right now? And it seemed to me part of it, too, was the whole degrees conferred thing, but part of it was I'm reading a scientific, is presented as a scientific paper. And the language, as you were saying, it was so bizarre. You said it so perfectly.
But unfortunately, that paper, as was mentioned, that's now being held up as, sexism doesn't exist. We're all good now.
Yes.
It reminds me of the climate change kind of debate. Because
Absolutely.
It's so similar, and I'm really worried we're getting into that phase. On one hand, that means that this is an important issue, because as soon as you get that level of opposition, it probably means you have a point. But on the other hand, it makes everything so murky, and this is not up for debate, and now we are having to defend all of the data that has existed all these years because of this one strange paper.
And we'll be right back with more Science for the People and Women in STEM after this.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and we've been discussing some of the recent research around women in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. My four panelists today are Ray Burks, postdoctoral research associate and analytical chemist in the Midwest. We have Jessica Cundiff, visiting assistant professor of psychology at Colgate University. Shohini Ghose, director of the Center for Women in Science at Wilfrid Laurier University. And Catherine Hill, vice president of research at the American Association of University Women. So it is obviously important to talk about the stats and research that exists around women in STEM fields, even if it sometimes feels like no one's listening. But it's equally important to talk about our own personal experiences. So when did you folks become interested in science?
This is Ray, and I got interested in science through crime. So went to FBI field office in an 8th grade trip and got to see some forensic scientists. And that was the first time for me, as far as I can remember, that science connected with me, that I thought, wow, you could do something with this. This is useful. And ever since then, I've been a super nerd. So
this is Catherine. I think I kind of fell in love with statistics. In my family, we're a very argumentative family, and when you have the stats on your side, I realized that I could win. So I sat down and after that considered to pursue statistics as part of what I've been doing and have been doing it ever since.
This is Shohini. I actually grew up in India, and back then there was not a lot of TV, but I remember there was one of the only American shows we got was Star Trek. And that was once a week, and it was the highlight of my life back then. And I also remember that, because of Star Trek, I was so excited because in the 80s, the first Indian astronaut went up to space. And that was really inspiring to me. So I think those were the important things that I remember from my past that got me really excited.
This is Jessica. I got interested in science probably because I've always been really good at math, and I like logical explanations and being able to have evidence for questions that I'm interested in investigating. I remember in high school, I took AP physics, and I was the only girl in the class, and I remember my experiences in math and science, in the physical sciences, as not necessarily being discouraged from them, but I also remember not being particularly encouraged to pursue those. So, I've often wondered perhaps maybe if I had been encouraged in a different way, I might have pursued a different type of science than what I currently am in.
Well, and that's a really good point. The rest of you, did you feel like you were encouraged in your scientific exploration?
I was definitely encouraged by my parents, and they are not scientists. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college and the first person to have a graduate degree. But they are huge learners, and they are also very nerdy in their own ways. So they were, once I was like, I'm going to be a blah, 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 they were like 100%. And in school, it was really a mixed bag. Some teachers were like, yay, and other teachers were just not supportive, not in the way that you would think you would be if, a student came up to you and was like, I'm really interested in this. And I think it depends for me, it really depended on who it was. And maybe it was because of who I was, being, a woman and a person of color. That you can have different experiences than the person right next to you.
So this is Shohini. I had pretty similar experiences to Ray. I was super encouraged by my parents who said I could basically do anything I wanted. But then as I went further and further in my academic career from undergraduate, graduate to graduate school in physics, things started changing. Of course, there were fewer and fewer women in my classes. And then it did become that mixed bag where some professors were very supportive, others not so much. I've been in classrooms where the professor walked in and said, "Good morning, gentlemen," and didn't even realize.
Yes.
So I've been mistaken for the front office secretary when I'm in the department. I've been asked to get the coffee. As I, moved further on in my career, once I started teaching, got my faculty position, I've had issues in classrooms. There's been racism, and of course sexism. But again, it's a mixed bag. It's not that I'd say that every person I meet, I have to sort of wonder whether they're going to be, being able to treat me fairly or not. Absolutely not. But it is there. And a lot of times there are small kinds of experiences, like being in meetings where, I think most of us women have experiences where you say something and it gets ignored, and then some man says it and suddenly everybody pays attention.
Yes.
And it sounds so stereotypical, but it actually happens. And then you wonder, what do you do? Should you say something, or will it sound like you're overreacting? And then you get this reputation of being the touchy one. So you really can't win. So you sort of have to find a way to negotiate all of that.
You have a lot of microaggressions. That's definitely a word that's coming up a lot more. And, I think the big gestures of inequality, people are almost getting to a point where that would be totally frowned upon. But it's the microaggressions and the things that, and I've had this happen in rooms full of people that you thought were totally, quote, enlightened, where you just said something, and yet you're like, okay, well, that was, and then the next, a white man says it, and it's like, oh, totally, that is, amen, brother. So I mean, and not only that, but just, questions of, like you were saying, of, well, can you pick up donuts for everybody? Well, why would I do that? Things that, why are you asking me this, or even tone policing for people of color, and not wanting, not only not to be the touchy one, but I think as a Black woman is, if I put my foot down and, just the idea of, I'm going to do exactly what my syllabus said. These are the rules, and that's what I operate within. Then, you go from, I think I'm being, civil and professional, but I always worry about, if I put my foot down, if I raise an issue, which really does need to be raised, it's getting a reputation of being the angry Black woman.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And then do I want to deal with that? And every single day, it's the thing where it's just your life, so you just operate within that mode. You don't think about how exhausting it is, but every day there is going to be, dozens, if not more than that, tiny decisions where you're like, no, it's just, this is the way it is, and I'm not going to make it a thing.
And let's talk about, let's put some more numbers on personal experiences, because there was a recent report, and it was conducted by the University of California's Hastings College of Law. And 100% of women of color interviewed in the study said they've experienced gender bias, compared to 93% of white women. But what I found even more interesting about this survey was, aside from the more common sexist issues, women of color were clearly subject to unwarranted stereotypes. For example, Black and Latina women said they were regularly mistaken for janitors.
Yep, I've had that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Asian American women felt more pressure to act traditionally feminine. Black women controlled emotion to avoid an angry Black female stereotype. Congratulations, Ray.
Yay!
Latina women reported being labeled as crazy when they expressed emotion, and Asian American women faced more pushback from peers if they acted assertively. So, in addition to everything else that being a woman in science entails, if you throw women of color on that, you are hooped.
And I think, those are important issues when we're talking about the status of women in STEM, is that there are experiences that we can all have in common, and that is definitely true. But I also think that we need to acknowledge that, we are not the same, and in some way, it's not a contest either. You're not having like a pressure Olympics. It's just that the concerns might be different, and there are definitely been times where some very well-meaning, tenured white female professor or higher up would say, you need to, you should say that. And I said this, and I have said, but this is what I'm dealing with. If I say that in exactly this tone, I'm not going to raise my voice. But I'm dealing with this additional issue, not just as coming across as whiny or aggressive or whatever, but I have to deal with the issue of the angry black woman, no matter if I am speaking in this tone or not. That's the reality. And I think that kind of, and the same thing goes with other intersections is, are we listening to and being cognizant of where people are at and their kind of, potpourri almost of, another panelist had said, you get to choose almost. You have so many biases, you get to choose. And sometimes you don't really you don't know what it is. You can't parse it out by saying, oh, well, this is sexism and this is racism. Sometimes it's all in one. It's a twofer. And so I think we need to be, and add to that any other additional challenges. And, we just need to be mindful of that we're all not in the same, we might all be in the same boat, but we're not all on the same deck. Some of us are in the, having a deck chair on the Titanic, and other of us are trapped at the lead.
This is Catherine. I just wanted to respond. I've been listening to all of you speak, and it's amazing to me how powerful these stereotypes and biases are in your daily experiences, even if they're not spoken, just because you know them already. No one has to tell you, something about a black woman is angry more than other people or something. You already have that somehow in the back of your mind, and it's influencing what you feel you can say and do. So I just want to remind the listeners of just how powerful these stereotypes and biases are.
You're tuned into Science for the People, and today's episode is all about women in science, tech, engineering, and math. So before we depress anyone any further, let's talk about solutions, please. So what are we seeing as ways to more effectively deal with gender issues in the classroom or in the workplace?
Well, this is Catherine. I want to put in a plug for the implicit bias work that's being done by Mallory Banaji and some of her colleagues. I think that this is something we've known about for a long time, but it is now being really put into practice in workplaces. And so I'd really like to see people find out about their biases. It's a simple, free test you can take. You can have your employees do it, and you don't need to do it together, but you just need to be able to come with that background and have some understanding of that concept, because we just know from our current discussion we were having that these things are very powerful.
And we will link to that on the website, by the way.
The one thing I wanted to say is that when we try to think about this issue of self-perception, self-confidence, so that we can get more young female students who are in fact performing well in math and science, but don't feel like they are confident enough to actually choose a career in it, there are now studies and practices that have been shown to be successful, where if you can address these directly up front in your classroom, then that shows that, in fact, that changes the perceptions of these girls and also changes their performance and their choices that they make later. So it is possible to address this question of self-confidence. The other piece of this is that there is this perception that, math is like a God-given talent, like playing music or something. And there are studies which show that this is perhaps not the best way to think about math. Math can be learned, and if you start thinking about it that way, then that also changes the performance of not just girls, but even boys in math. So there are ways to actually change what we do in the classroom in order to, create a more level playing field.
There is also features in the environment that we can change too. Features such as Sapna Sharon at University of Washington, she's done some great studies looking at how the actual physical space can influence whether students want to engage in computer science or maybe avoid the domain. And so by physical space, I kind of mean the objects that are in the room, the posters that are on the boards, the colors that are being used, how the desks are arranged. All of these objects and spaces can signify whether certain stereotypes might be at play and whether you feel like you really belong in that environment or not. So making some physical changes can help, but also making changes with how people interact with one another. I feel like a lot of interventions are kind of focused from a target perspective, like what can women do to stay resilient and overcome these barriers that are faced. But I think it's also important to think about, well, how can we change those barriers? And really getting men involved as part of the solution. And part of that has to do with, creating communities, building community between students, between colleagues that fosters respect and valuing of each other, really making connections with each other, showing people how they're similar to one another. Those sorts of things I think are really important to foster those interpersonal connections.
There's also this other very famous test called the Draw a Scientist test. I'm sure you've heard about this, where this is a test that has been administered to students at different levels around the world. And it's really simple. It's just as it describes. You just sit down and you're asked to draw a scientist. And across the board, what's found is that students will draw a man in a lab coat with crazy hair. So this is, I guess, the Einstein effect. So I think what is reflected here is that there are some very specific stereotypes about what a scientist is. Who is a scientist? So there aren't as many role models, female role models for younger students, both male and female. And there's this sort of, ongoing stereotype that never seems to go away. However, if female role models are promoted, and there are so many successful female scientists out there, it's just that they tend to be invisible and we're not talking about them enough. We're not promoting them enough. So that's another thing that we can actually do, which is to try to talk, not just in our everyday conversations, but through whatever organizations we're part of, to promote these role models, have more of these women scientists maybe speak at conferences, in schools, at workshops, just so that we can break down this one, single mode identity that we have of scientists.
And I think going along with that, it's also important to note that it's not just role models, but it's really important that girls can connect with the role models that they're seeing, that they can really identify with those role models and see those role models as like kind of a future self. Because there are certain ways to do role models that are not going to be inspiring if girls don't see that they could ever achieve, the high achievements that those role models have been doing. Going along with that, you were bringing up kind of this image of science, and I think that's really important. I think what's missing, people don't know what engineers really do, or they don't know what computer scientists really do. They don't know that computer scientists and engineers actually work together in teams and that they're helping to solve problems that have real impact on people's lives. Like, I don't think that that's very clear to, especially, kids in elementary or middle school. I don't think that that's apparent. And so I think that there does need to be some sort of education around the image of scientists, engineers, people in computing fields.
Now, we are basically completely out of time, but I want to mention one more thing, and it's something that I'm always concerned about, because we've been talking a lot about perception. So how does the perception of gender discrimination affect the outcomes for women in STEM fields? Because sometimes I worry, are we making it worse by talking about it and potentially scaring off women from these fields altogether? Or are we letting women know that this is what they're getting into and that it's okay to talk about it and they're not alone? So what is your position on that?
I don't think that people are not aware of these stereotypes. I think they know about them. So I think when we voice things that are just part of our daily lives, I don't necessarily think we reinforce them. Now, there could be evidence of that, but I think that when you're not telling someone, we're not telling women and girls anything they don't already know when we say that computering and engineering and other sciences or male-dominated. They know that already. So by calling it what it is, I think we do help talk to them about how that's going to be different.
I think that the idea that that they don't know, that you can scare them off, but I also think that you cannot effectively deal with something if you're going to pretend or put on a front. This is the status of the workforce, of the academic field. We know that it's an issue, and here's what we're doing, or here's what we're not doing. I mean, I think that the full picture, you treat people as if they have agency, and you come with your eyes wide open. Especially if you have people that are working for change, then you say, here are the issues and here's what we're doing about it. And here are some real allies. Here are some professional organizations that are doing awesome stuff. Here are these support groups. And you give them the full measure of what's going on. And I think if anything, it shows a person that you're giving them a realistic picture. You're not just selling them a bill of goods. You're saying that this is real life, and like any other corner, this is what's going on.
I think it is important how you present the issue, though, because I remember when I was in grad school, I did not want to join any of these women's organizations because I wanted to prove that I didn't need any extra help because I was as good as the guys. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, if you are talking about support and things like this, it sounds like somehow women need more help. And that, of course, harms the cause. Right. So it is important to present it in the way of not just trying to help somebody who somehow needs the help, but because we don't have a level playing field. That's really what is important.
Yes. Great conversation, folks. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You'll find links to all of our panelists and the research that we mentioned on implicit bias and cultural depictions of scientists on our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. After the break, we'll take a closer look at the experiences of women in tech with Brianna Wu, head of development at video game company Giant Spacekat. Stay tuned.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Now, we wanted to mention one more thing here on Science for the People, because we can't talk about women in STEM without talking about women in gaming. I'm joined by Brianna Wu, the head of development at Giant Spacekat, a game studio specializing in cinematic experiences using the Unreal Engine. She's also a frequent speaker on women in tech issues, and in the past, she's worked as a journalist and a politico. Thanks for being here, Brianna.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, so let's talk about Gamergate for the people who are lucky enough to have never heard it.
Oh, I envy them deeply. That must be great.
How did this all go down?
Gamergate kind of, it all started with tension here in the game development industry. What we've had is an explosion of women playing video games in the last few years. As recently as 2007, the gaming audience was only 19% women. Today, it's 49%. So, along with this massive explosion of women gaming, you're basically seeing the industry changing. Because of that, it's not really the domain of, adolescent boys anymore. We're all gaming. And, what you're seeing is a new generation of game developers like myself getting into the industry and kind of, looking at some of the things like hypersexualized women and, hiring practices in the industry and looking at it and saying like, gosh, maybe we need to look at this stuff. So Gamergate at its core is, a very violent backlash against that is harassing women out of the industry. I actually had to cancel an appearance in one of the biggest events in the industry last week because of the number of death threats I've had. It's now 48 in the last 5 months. So to kind of give your audience just a very quick history of it, it basically started with Boston game developer, my friend Zoe Quinn. She had a boyfriend basically that was very upset with her and leaked entire details of their love life online, up for the entire audience of gamers. It was a lot of hearsay, and basically you had from that what exploded was like what I would call the most sexist incident in the entire history of video games. People invading Zoe's private life, harassing her, staging demonstrations against her at conventions. And it's just kind of like spread to all the women in the industry now. All of us are being harassed constantly. And it's like there's a culture war going on when we're just trying to do our jobs.
Well, where did the term Gamergate come from?
Well, it came from, science fiction actor named Adam Baldwin, who, is not really the best ally to women that, there's been. He comes from a certain political background and, is kind of antagonistic towards women and, things like gay rights, and, he's kind of a very loud Twitter presence because of that. And, all of this happened to Zoe, and he basically tweeted this out like, this video attacking Zoe and this hashtag Gamergate on top of it. So, Gamergate literally started from, trying to spread, basically hearsay and gossip about my friend's private love life.
But the people that identify with or gather under the Gamergate mantle, they would say it's about ethics in gaming journalism, correct?
Well, that's the pretext. There's pretext and subtext. I'm a software engineer. So, when I write some code, I don't evaluate that code off what I hope it's going to be. I evaluate that code off what the outcome is. So if you look at what the actual outcome of Gamergate is, Newsweek ran a story and figured out who Gamergate was actually harassing. So they don't go after game journalists. They go after Zoe Quinn, Anita Sarkeesian, and myself. Anita and I are actually two of the most harassed women on the entire internet, according to, several, studies that have been done on that.
So what's your relationship with Gamergate?
Well, it's not complicated. Gamergate before, when it was kind of this unruly mob, before it really got a name, basically targeted and harassed my friend Samantha Allen out of the industry. Samantha Allen, critiqued a gaming journalism site known as Giant Bomb, because they are the only news site that chooses to not hire women. They've never hired any women. They don't have any minorities whatsoever. And it's just very much kind of a brogue gaming journalism site. And, she's tweeted a very mild critique when they hired, yet another hire that didn't have diversity, which, by the way, is a huge problem in our industry. Another major gaming journalism site, Game Informer, has 17 out of 18 of their editors, which are men. So, she critiqued like a lack of diversity. And what she had from that was just a mob going after her, harassing her, threatening her, until the point she has said, you know what, there are easier ways to make a living, guys. And she quit. It got me really, really angry. I don't like to see my friends bullied. And, I stood up. I said, this is wrong. And, they kind of started going after me. They had a very famous series of death threats against me, was sent by Gamergate to the point where I was actually, a character in a Law and Order episode that came out 3 weeks ago. So, it's actually kind of just turned into this, it's a nightmare. It's not an exaggeration to say these people have destroyed my life. I get death threats routinely, rape threats routinely. I'm harassed no matter what I say or do. Like I said at the beginning of the show, I have one of the largest teams of women in the entire game development industry. We're really well known for developing games for women. And, we actually can't show our work at PAX East because my employees feel unsafe. They came to me a few weeks ago and said, like, Brianna, I'm going to have, like, one of my employees, she's going to give birth in 2 months. We have another one. She has a daughter, and they really feel unsafe in this environment. So we can't even do our jobs.
See, now, outside of the internet, practically no one has heard of this. But how, well, unless they watch the Law and Order episode.
Right.
But how reflective is this of the gaming community as a whole?
Well, I think it's a hard question to answer. If you're talking about gamers themselves, sadly, there is a certain segment of them that like fiercely identifies gamers, and they feel like their identity is under attack. And, gaming and gamers do have a problem with sexism. I say that as a lifelong gamer. I've been completely addicted to video games since 1985 when my mom got me a Nintendo Entertainment System. But, this is a really serious problem with the consumer. I think what's more telling, I think it's a problem with the industry itself. I think the player is just responding to a professional environment that's kind of made this adolescent gamer, like male gamer, the king of the universe and cater to their every adolescent whim for 30 years. And, I think any reasonable person outside of the industry can look at video games and see they don't really represent or include women very well. So, I kind of feel like Gamergate is a symptom, and the disease is an industry that really isn't willing to look in the mirror and look at its hiring practices towards women.
But does all this, the horribleness, I can only say horribleness, mainly exist on the internet? I mean, how do you folks respond to each other offline?
I think that would be, like I was speaking at the UC Irvine just a few days ago, and there was a Gamergator that came up after my panel, and it was a perfectly civil conversation. But, the fear is, like I said, I've had 58 death threats in, just a few months, and the fear is it's going to spill over into the real world. So, it's not just online harassment. Like when you have people threatening to blow up PAX East, which was a tweet that I got and had to report to the FBI and, had to send to PAX security. This is not, it's going beyond online harassment. Like it's disrupting the real world. Yeah.
And I'm wondering how this affects, young women who are actually thinking of going into game developing themselves.
I get emails all the time from women that talk about how scared they are of being the target of this. There are a lot of young girls out there that, they're part of this new gaming audience. They're part of the 49% of women in the game. And, they see this and they want to go into game development. It's a very common dream for gamers, but they also see, our private lives being served up for entertainment for a mob, and it's terrifying. So, I have dozens and dozens of letters on my computer of, young girls that have written me and told me, they don't want to become game developers, seeing just how frightening the atmosphere is. Even on the adult side, I was out to dinner last night with, some research engineers, and they were, these are women that are computer scientists. They're at the top of their field. They can go work anywhere they want. And, they kind of choose to stay in academia because they look at, the game development industry and some of the practices over there. It doesn't feel safe for them. So, this is an extremely serious problem.
So what do you tell those young women who ask your advice?
I look them in the eye and I say, we're going to make this better for you, and don't give up. I am just completely, I love games so much, and I'm completely unwilling to accept that this is going to be the industry forever. Games don't belong to, this very specific kind of toxic gamer. Games belong to all of us. I love video games. And, those young girls that are playing games, like, I see the sparkle in their eye when they get it, and they have artistic dreams. And, I'm just not willing to settle for being bullied out of this field. So, I tell them we're going to make it better for them.
Brianna, thanks very much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
You'll find links to Brianna Wu and Giant Spacekat on our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. While you're there, you can listen to all of our past episodes, click the links to connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Google+, and to subscribe to the show in iTunes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Science for the People. Science for the People is recorded in Edmonton, Alberta. The show is produced by Raychelle Saunders. Ryan Bromsgrove is our promotions manager. Our social media manager is Chelsea Butler. K.O. Myers updates our website. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. Ed Haynes is our guest coordinator. We get research help from Josh Witten. The show is edited by K.O. Myers and Ryan Bromsgrove. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. The show is hosted by Raychelle Saunders, Marie Claire Shanahan, and me, Desiree Schell.